We begin at the top of the odds board for the win totals with the Alabama Crimson Tide. Woo! Caesar Sportsbook has this one at 11.5, plus 100 to the over, minus 120 to the under. We got that huge game against Miami in Atlanta. The rest of the non-con, though, Ron Mercer, Southern Miss, New Mexico State. The East draw does include one of, I would argue, the more difficult scenarios that you possibly could have from the SEC West. You got to go to the Swamp to play Florida. Then, of course, that Tennessee game that will be in Tuscaloosa. I don't want to speak for the rest of this podcast, but had that one as a dub, no matter the location. 11.5. Are we going with principles? Are we going with what we think's going to happen? How are we attacking this one?
I mean, principle, I have to go under.
Right.
Because it's really hard to go undefeated, but I'm going over. I don't know where Alabama's losing. And I know there's a ton of concern about everything that they have to replace and all that stuff, but man, they do that every year. They went from Tua and oh my God, how are they going to replace Tua? Well, Mac Jones comes in and Mac Jones is just as great in that offense. And while I do have some questions about how the offense is going to look, it's also incredibly talented. It has talented receivers. They'll have a good offensive line. They have a good quarterback. They have a good defense. And while Saban, it's hard to go undefeated for a full season. Saban, in the playoff era, I think they've gone undefeated in the regular season 3 or 4 times. They've lost in the playoff, but they've gotten through the regular season 12-0, or they've lost in the SEC championship. I think, but
five times.
Yeah. So the Miami game in the Open is tough, but Miami I have questions about, especially early in the season. I think Florida on the road in that third game is pretty difficult because that's Alabama's still going to be figuring itself out. So maybe that game could be closer than we expect, but I still think Alabama wins that game more often than not. Texas A&M on the road, I think Alabama probably wins that game more often than not, because until, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, until the Aggies start showing that explosiveness on offense, I'm not going to give them credit. I'm not going to give them the ability to keep up with Alabama's offense over 60 minutes. So I just don't see an opponent on this schedule that I'm fairly fully confident in keeping up with Alabama for a full game. So I'm going 12-0.
They're going to be a double-digit favorite against everybody on their schedule.
You think they'll be double-digit against Texas A&M in College Station?
That's the one I was going to point to. Yeah. I'm going to take the under here, and I really like this Alabama team. I will note that I don't think Bama has been 11.5 ever, to my knowledge.
It's probably been at 11 a couple times, but never 11.5.
Correct. 11.5 is pretty wild. I think it is largely a reflection of what happened last year. But of all the teams in the SEC West, there's only 2 that I'm confident will not be as good as they were last year. And one of those teams is Alabama. I think a couple of teams in the West probably got a good bit better. And if you're betting this over, and I don't think, Tom, you maybe disagree. I'm probably not going to have this in my actual Locks Pod picks. But new QB, who I really like, but he's still new. New receivers, who I really like, but they're still new. New pieces in the secondary, again, who I like, but they're still new. I really think they're going to wreck people up front this year with the front 7 in a way that they actually didn't do last year with Will Anderson and Tim Smith, who was one of my favorite prospects coming out. They flipped him from the Gators, down the stretch. But they have to run this at Florida, at A&M, at Auburn, Miami neutral, LSU at home, Ole Miss at home. The fact that their number is 11.5 suggests it is possible, perhaps very possible, to do so. I just don't think that I can't get there with the math betting over an 11.5 where there's 6 teams I think athletically can kind of run with them. You know what I mean? It's difficult for me to do. I'm high on a couple of these teams we'll talk about in a second. So I'm definitely a believer in Alabama. Alabama fans, I got you here, but for 11.5 for the picks pod that we're doing, I have to go ahead and take the under.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed in Fornelli.
Tom, I know, you think you know a guy. You think you know a guy.
Somebody on this show has got to stand for something, or you fall for anything. I think there's a country song that talks about that.
11.5. This is insanity. You have to take the under here. And I think I totally agree with Bud's points. The schedule is tough, right? I think a quarterback. Now, this is the pro. Like, if Derek King was healthy, I think that Miami game would be way more interesting. I'm kind of curious how much they're going to use him in the run game, and I don't think that's one of their losses. But I think A&M has proven to be closer. I think the Florida game in Gainesville could be an interesting one with a new look offense with Emory Jones and some, a better defense that could possibly pose some problems for Bryce Young in a first-time hostile environment that's there. First-year starting quarterback. I know they've replaced him all of us felt pretty good about Spencer Rattler last year, stepping into Lincoln Riley's system too. And by all accounts, he flourished. He had a phenomenal year at the end of it, but early in the season, in some fourth quarter situations, he cost them games. He cost them 2 games with some bad throws. I don't even know if it comes down to Bryce Young making a similar mistake, but I also think Ole Miss last year was a handful offensively for Alabama's defense. They're going to be a little bit better defensively. Again, I don't think that's where a loss comes from, but it wouldn't shock me at the end of the season if you said, oh, that was the game where Nick Saban, Lane Kiffin pulled off one of these, surprises, and he's out there trolling him after the game, and yet Ole Miss maybe 8-4. I could also see that being the only loss on Alabama's schedule, and they go on to win a national championship. So much like Bud, this isn't a troll Alabama, you guys aren't that good. The schedule is a gauntlet. You've got a bunch of new pieces. We have Bill O'Brien taking over an offense, and we're just going to assume he's going to plug in, what Lane Kiffin was doing with all his college experience recently. Sark came, but he got to watch Lane. Then he kind of adapted. I think there's an adaptation period for Bill O'Brien too. So all of those factors, I'm going to take the under.
Ole Miss's defense is going to be better. It's only going to allow 8 touchdowns instead of 9.
Listen, Danny, I'm glad you mentioned that because, again, I think it is – I think the over is a bad bet, and sometimes bad bets hit. Just sort of principle under on this one. But the thing that I gravitated towards was I don't give all of my trust to Bill O'Brien and Doug Marrone and all the turnover that they've got, not only on the field with this offense, but also with this staff. You lose Steve Sarkisian, Jeff Banks, Charles Huff. I mean, you lose a lot of the brain trust of how they put together game plans during the week, how they call games on the weekend. I mean, Nick Saban running around. I don't know if Bill O'Brien's, I imagine he's going to be an up in the press box guy. I don't know if he's going to be on the field. If he is smart, he's not on the field because he's going to get his ass chewed out by Nick Saban time and time again. And then one more thing, if anything happens to Bryce Young, guys, we're down to Bear Bryant's great-grandson. And if Bear Bryant's great-grandson is out there, 11-1 is 100% a possibility, especially considering some of these matchups. So, Tom, I'm surprised, but again, I would not be surprised to see a 12-0 in Alabama. They're that daggum good.